I direct the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation and publish a blog called The Washington Note. Thank you very much for being here. This is a new experience for me, this congressional auditorium. This is an alternative meeting room for the U.S. Congress. I guess if either of the chambers can't be used for painting or, redoing the rug or for whatever other reasons you may think of, this is where they'll meet, and I think it's quite an honor and privilege to be here. I want to thank Congressman Mike Honda and his staff, in particular Michael Shank, for arranging this room. It's a very, very rare privilege to have this all day, and while you folks are on the front end of the day, we're going all the way until 5 o'clock. I'm also very grateful to C-SPAN, which is covering this today and is going to be recording the entire program, so special greetings to our C-SPAN viewers and visitors this afternoon. And we have a very full program. Just in starting things off, let me share with you what the behind-the-scenes deal is with why we're doing this conference entitled Cutting the Fuse, Moving Beyond the War on Terror. My friend Bob Pape of the University of Chicago has launched, as you'll see later today, an important new website called the Chicago Project on Suicide Terrorism, CPOST, which is on the web. And I've been through this. I've spent hours looking at how Professor Pape has indexed every case of suicide terrorism, I may be getting this wrong, at least since 1980, if not before, and done an incredible look at all of the component pieces. Was it, looking at gender, looking at cause, looking at the basic news reporting about this, and creating, I think, the world's first large, publicly accessible database, cross-referenced across many other values and variables, to give people an understanding of what may be going on, look for trends. And many of you know that Bob wrote the book Dying to Win, which sort of profiled the phenomenon of suicide terrorism. This new book, which has just been released this week, The Explosion of Global Suicide Terrorism and How to Stop It, Cutting the Fuse, actually takes what Pape and his co-author James Feldman have looked at in this and begun to look at the questions of strategy and looking at military strategy and defense strategy. And it's an interesting approach because, as you'll see in this conference today covers the range of perspectives, has people from many different corners of the public policy debate about how the United States should manage its foreign policy and national security objectives. And what Pape is arguing is if we're trying to achieve those objectives, then we're creating as much blowback, undermining those objectives, and trying to put on the table at least alternative ways of thinking about it. And we're very pleased, from the Chief of Naval Operations to Thomas Kane, who is a chair of the 9/11 Commission, to Zalmay Khalilzad and others, are coming in a very constructive way to have this discussion with us. So we're very pleased to do that. I just want to thank everyone for being here. I'm going to be with you all day. I'll be one of the co-moderators of today's program, as will Bob Pape, who'll be presenting as well. But let me ask Bob Pape to say a few words of welcome, too. Please welcome Bob Pape.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great. Thank you very much. It's very exciting to be here today. I'm going to resist telling you much about my work just for a few moments. I really just want to welcome you all to our conference, Cutting the Fuse, Moving Beyond the War on Terror. This is the first conference for the University of Chicago ever on Capitol Hill, and it's the first conference for our center, the Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism in Washington. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank the Carnegie Corporation in New York, the Department of Defense, the Cato Institute, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, the Young Professionals in Foreign Policy, and Foreign Policy Magazine for contributing in a whole variety of ways to make this day possible. And I would especially like to thank my good friend, Steve Clemens, and the New America Foundation for their pivotal role in partnering with us to bring the Chicago Project to Capitol Hill. Today, as Steve told you, we have a range of speakers and panels related to the research on the Chicago Project, a growing group of social scientists centered at the University of Chicago and other academic institutions devoted to producing new social science research to improve core national security policies for the United States and the international community at large. On our program, you will see research and people from the Chicago Project, but also much more. And more than anything else, you will see the spirit behind the Chicago Project. Our program involves policymakers, academic thinkers, policy intellectuals, and journalists from a wide range of perspectives who almost surely will not agree, but who share a deep commitment to the thoughtful pursuit of effective national policies on terrorism and other core national security issues. Our goal is to offer new ideas to move beyond the war on terror toward a better future, but in a manner that allows for meaningful debate, testing assumptions, and for participants from a variety of different starting points as serious partners in our discussion. Our goal, in other words, is to encourage new ideas in an environment of intellectual Darwinism, the consideration of viable new policies in a competitive setting so that the best policy really does win. Social science has contributed to policy before, from the research linking smoking and lung cancer in the 1940s and 50s that's led to national policies to reduce smoking, to research linking excess money supply and inflation done at the University of Chicago in the 1960s that helps central banks around the world to this day keep inflation in check. Our hope is that the Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism will foster social science that contributes to our core national security policies, and today, this conference is our first step. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you very much, Bob. So now our marathon begins. I would be remiss, there are many of you that are distinguished people, so I don't hold this against you, but I do want to pay special note to how honored I am that Ambassador Tom Pickering, who was our country's leading civil servant in the State Department, Foreign Service, has done everything, and so Tom, it's great to see you with us today. Terrific. Now let me say a few words about Brian Baird. Congressman Brian Baird is from the 3rd District of Washington State. He sits on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, the House Science Committee, the House Budget Committee. He's on lots of committees. He's just published a book entitled Character, Politics, and Responsibility, Restarting the Heart of the American Republic. Before he came on to take these duties on as his constituency's representative here in Washington, he chaired the Department of Psychology at Pacific Lutheran University and was a practicing clinical neuropsychologist and a distinguished chair. But let me tell you the other side of Brian Baird. Brian is he's leaving Congress. He's here. He's definitely happier than anybody else I've seen in Congress, and it's an honor to have him with us. He's become a very close friend of the New America Foundation and mine, and worked on us from everything from big questions on what's going on in the economy to how this country needs to sort of rethink or at least think about its foreign policy portfolio and national security questions, and he is a brave person. He's gone to areas of the world that we would just say were on the edge. He was one of the first people into Gaza after the Israel-Gaza crisis, with a number of other congressmen and women that went with him. And he's tried to bring intellectual challenge to some of the important debates that Congress has had. He played a vital role, for instance, in the health care debate, in which he was one of the leading critics for a while of the health care plan, ended up supporting the president's plan, but has used his position, I think, honorably in the way congressmen should, which is to really wrestle with the great ideas and not to get swept in one current or another. So without further ado, please welcome Congressman Brian Baird.
Good morning, everyone. Steve, thank you for the kind introduction, and I have to say, I think one of the most exciting developments in this city in many, many years has been the New America Foundation, especially on topics relating to Middle East. But if you name the topic, some of the most out-of-the-box, comprehensive thinking, innovative thinking, I think is coming out of New America, and Steve is at the forefront of much of that. And Bob, I think you're right on the money with this effort. As a former psychologist, and I'll speak a little bit about that today, the idea that we try to understand what motivates people makes a lot of sense. I want to share with you a funny thing. The phrase, a funny thing happened on the way here today. Truly it did. I bumped into my dear friend Donna Edwards from Maryland, a fantastic member of Congress. We served together on the Science Committee. Donna and I traveled along with Peter Welch, and earlier my friend Keith Ellison and I to Gaza with New America, actually. Donna shared with me the following story. She's been asked to speak to a group that has a policy that supports the two-state solution in Israel and Palestine, but that has also said, but if two states doesn't work, maybe we look at the viability of a one-state solution. So Donna's just been asked to go talk to them, and she then gets a flurry of emails saying, no, you can't talk to those people. And if you talk to those people, then we may not be able to support you anymore. And she said, well, wait a second. The other group in town, AIPAC, does that. What is J Street doing saying I can't talk to people? I may be speaking out of school here. This was a conversation in front of Starbucks. But it is literally 10 minutes ago. But it is indicative of part of the problem we face. It's a town that imposes groupthink with a ferocity that I think it was Irving Janis who wrote that book, if I'm not mistaken, could not have imagined. It imposes it through electorate actions. It imposes it through financial contributions, a host of ways that limits how we think. And I want to challenge that a little bit today, and then we'll hopefully have a bit of Q&A. One of the fundamental core problems, seems to me, is how we define the problem at hand. Terrorism, I think, in most of our minds in Congress is often implicitly. We don't, intriguingly enough, we don't actually stop oftentimes and say what exactly is it we mean about this phenomenon that we're waging war upon. But the implicit, assumed definition, I think, is something horrific and unjustified that happens to us for no good reason. There are so many limitations in that definition that prevent us from solving the problem. Something horrific is valid. Something unjustified is questionable. Now, you cannot say that. You cannot say that it is worth asking, is there ever justification for a terrorist act? I do not think there is justification for a terrorist act, but the people who engage in them certainly do. And it is worth us asking why they do that. Happens to us. Well, what about all the things that happen to others, including some of the things we do? We are not allowed to ask that in this town either. 6 years ago, or more than that, Senator Patty Murray, who's up for re-election this year, was talking with a bunch of school children post-September 11th, not long after September 11th. And they asked her, why do people do this to us? And she said, well, here are some of the differences. And she tried to give those young people a perspective from the other side. What happened? Somebody had a video camera in the room. Patty Murray was an apologist for terrorists. It became a major issue because she was trying to help school children understand issues in a different way. We will not solve this problem if we continue that way. The challenge is members of Congress, again, have groupthink enforced. If you just go to certain countries, you get demerits. If you say certain things, you get demerits. If you meet with other groups, you get demerits. The idea that we would have a rational, thoughtful, intellectual discussion is proscribed. Instead, we just are supposed to march lockstep with administration policy or received ideology or something else. And it's not going to work. There's a comedian of Arab descent who I'm told has a joke, and he's asked, so where do you get suicide bombers? I'm sure you know this, Bob. He says, oh, the suicide hotline. Now, it's pretty funny, actually, if you think about it. You know, you call up and you say, I'm thinking of killing myself. He says, you know, that's not such a bad idea, but let us recommend a methodology. Now, it's a funny joke, except that, as in so many good jokes, there's a real grain of truth to it. And here's the grain of truth that I take from it. As a psychologist, I came to understand that behavior makes sense. I may not always agree with it. It may not always have desirable consequences. But in some ways, it makes some sense to the person engaging in it. Part of the job of a psychologist, and I think part of the job of our foreign policy, must be to help create conditions in which alternative behaviors make more sense. There's a famous psychologist named Donald Meichenbaum who reversed the direction of how we look at child abuse. And as a parent of 5-year-old boys, I understand the twin boys, I understand this very well. His premise was we look at child abuse as the anomaly. He says, if you really think about it, anybody who's had children has at least more than once wanted to throw them down the stairs. Now, of course you can't say that because they're always in love with our children and they're always angels and we never get upset. Michael Baum's point was this: the amazing thing is not that there is child abuse, the amazing thing is that it's not rampant. And anybody who's had young children gets it. At about 3 in the morning when they get up and you're just flat exhausted, if you haven't occasionally had the desire, you're either far better than me, which I'll grant is very likely, but maybe you're not also being fully honest. It's difficult. That's a mild example. In the case of terrorism, and here's something you can never say, in some instances, in some conditions that we contribute to the creation of, a fair question is, what other response would you expect? What other response would you expect? When we engage in activities that create indignity, that impose suffering on civilian population, that deprive people of freedoms, that support totalitarian regimes, some response will occur. Terrorism is one manifestation of that. Now, ironically, we often say, well, there ought to be an alternative. We ought to promote nonviolent activity. And indeed we should. Take Palestine, which I'm very familiar with. If you look at the resume, the guy's chair of the Energy and Environment Subcommittee, what's he talking about terrorism? Steve was kind enough to mention I've spent an awful lot of time in Gaza and Palestine. In fact, to my knowledge, more than any other American official in Gaza since Cass led. And what else would you expect if you see the conditions on the ground there? The amazing thing to me, when I visit Gaza and visit some of the towns encircled by walls in the West Bank, is the dignity and the integrity and the passion for compassion that many of the Palestinians manifest. They are dead set against allowing their children to fall into the trap of desperation that can lead to terrorism. They are courageous, heroic people. You meet the psychologists, the teachers, the doctors, the political, social leaders, business people, working their hearts out to try to say, we've got to give these kids another alternative. I talked to a clinical psychologist who was driving with his 8-year-old son down the road when the car in front of them was vaporized and the passengers of the car spilled out on fire and died before his child's eyes. A few weeks later, the son looked pretty despondent, not surprisingly, I suppose, and this psychologist, Palestinian psychologist, asked his son, what's going on? And the son said, Daddy, I want to be a suicide bomber. And he said, why? Because we're going to get killed anyway. I want to take somebody with me. Now, this was not a child raised in a cult of death, except that which has been imposed upon him. But it was not a child who was raised in a radical madrasa and schooled that he was going to go see virgins. He was 8. This was a child whose life experience had given him such a sense of desperation and hopelessness that this seemed to be one of his most viable alternatives. Now, again, we say you should look at nonviolence. A month ago, I met with Mustafa Barghouti, some of you know, a Palestinian leader who's advocate for nonviolence, and 4 or 5 individual leaders of their villages who champion nonviolence. What's happening to people who engage in nonviolence? They're being imprisoned without trial, they're being beaten, and the world is largely ignoring it. If you want to change behavior, you have to have a viable alternative. If you suppress the viable alternative, what else would you expect? What I would suggest is that I think we need to make sure that we first address the conditions that can contribute to the desperation. Second, that we support alternatives. And then third, on the other side, I think a cold, hard reality is also necessary. What I've said so far may sound like fairly what you might expect from a psychologist and a Democrat. There are also really horrible people in the world who ideologically, pathologically, enjoy killing other human beings. They have to be killed. I'm sorry, but I think it's true. We probably have to be prepared to cope with both realities. And we're terrible in Congress, and I think as a public in this country, at dealing with both the realities. It's much easier to say everybody who engages in terrorism is of the latter sort, or they're only fighting us because we are all bad. Nope. There are some people who are horrific human beings with destructive, pathological ideology as we see it. They seek to impose that upon us and the rest of the world, and we have to stop them. And they don't mind terrorism because they think it's part of some personal or divine or political mission, and we have to confront that reality as well. To the degree that we can address the first set of issues I was describing, we will be much, much more effective addressing the second, because far fewer people will fall victim to the second. Now, let me close and open up some questions by referring it back to the institution I serve in, the Congress. Increasingly, I'm afraid, it is harder and harder and harder in political life to engage in this kind of dialogue. Those of you with flip phones, I'm thankful not to see any here, but I think C-SPAN's covering it, so I'm toast anyway. And if you read my book, A Shameless Plug, you'll see that I'm toast anyway, because the stuff I say in there is way out. But you have to be able to look at things objectively, and there has to be a constituency that values that, a constituency in the media, a constituency in the public who says, I may or may not agree with this person, but I'm glad they're asking the questions. I'm glad they're not afraid to make me think in new ways. Instead, what happens is people pander incessantly, and the best way to get the media is to pander more than the other guy. I think Newt Gingrich has engaged in that in the mosque, to name names, in the mosque issue. I think it's a perfectly fair question to ask, if we are to allow a mosque, which I believe the First Amendment says we should, is it not fair to ask other countries, would they allow synagogues or Christian churches or Baha'i faith? That is a perfectly fair question and an essential one. But how you ask it means everything, and why you ask it's even more important. So, too, I think it's silly and counterproductive and counter to our First Amendment to ban the hijab or other covering. But at the same time, is it not fair to ask, why can my wife not walk down the streets of Islamabad without being spat upon? Those are fair questions and responsible questions. We need to ask both sides of that. The political pressure is to only go with one side, or on the other side, to only go with the other. On the left, it's great to scream about how awful it is to ban the hijab, or how awful it is to fight against the mosque, but it is only fair to say, but wait a second, there are other countries that are more intolerant, to be perfectly honest, and we need to confront that intolerance even as we confront our own. And so the challenge is, the last thing is this. Terror is not something just that happens to us because external people oppose it. Terror, at the end of the day, is a psychological response. Back to the Palestinians again. What astonishes me is how they refuse to be terrorized. They just won't let it happen, by and large. Their leaders, people like Mustafa Barghouti and many, many others. They've been through hell. They have bombs dropped on them, smart bombs, tanks come in, all sorts of things, and they're hanging in there. We need, I believe, while we address the other issues, to internally adjust our mindset to this reality. For some time to come, in spite of the efforts of Bob Pape, New America, all the rest of us here, in spite of our massive defense capabilities, we're going to get hit from time to time. This city will get hit again. Some of us may die. Whether that creates terror is up to us. And we have to address that. We have to not promise people that under no circumstances whatsoever will somebody ever slip through, because they will, and they will kill some people. But how it affects us is under our control, and we need to think very soberly about that and maturely about that, because otherwise the terrorists, they will not win, but they will succeed in disrupting our way of life and disrupting the very values that we hold most dear and that distinguish us from them in the most constructive way possible. With that, let's have...
Great, Brian. Thank you very much. Thank you for your candor. I won't say that you're toast if you were to run again, but it's nice to get a dose of candor. It's also nice to hear someone talk about resilience. I'd like to open the floor in a minute, but let me ask you one thing. I'm a blogger. I write this, and I've noticed a tendency in the blogosphere of late, whether you're writing in the middle, the right, or the left, for folks to engage in something that has bothered me a lot as I've traveled through the Middle East. And what I've seen in the Middle East is a kind of currency in conspiracy theories, and the use of conspiracy theories to rationalize what people may see, trying to explain what's going on, and an awful lot of effort in some places in the Middle East to try to research or organize or filter what they see through this. And I see this coming to this country, in part becoming a part of our own dialogue and discourse in a way that is almost a rejection of empirical, rejection of sort of an Enlightenment approach to looking at things. And I'm wondering if you've thought about that as a politician who's written about, you've been knocked around a lot for some of the things that you've done. But maybe we need another book, Bob, for somebody to study what this is rather than talking about it. But I'm writing about this now as conspiracism in the United States and how this has become such a feature of how we report or filter, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, how you see people associated, people who may speak on the podium with someone, and how that is becoming to dominate more and more of our political discourse. And if you have any comments on that, then I'll open to the floor.
Well, I think you're hit on a real problem, especially, I think, but it's true on both the left and the right, interesting enough. On the extreme wings, I loathe the comments about President Obama as a fascist, but let's be serious. People said the same thing about President Bush on the left, in admittedly a different way, and I've been on the receiving end of both, so I'm going to say there is a qualitative difference. But the whole business of, is he secretly trying to turn America into a Muslim socialist nation? Why can't we just say, I disagree with the man's policies? There has to be something much deeper, much more sinister, much more pernicious, in part because that then justifies the craziness itself. If you just said, I disagree with the man's policies, fine, engage in political activism. You don't have to put camo on and crawl around the woods of Michigan or Washington. But if you believe in this darker force, there's a fundamental, I think, a fundamental human need among many of us to be heroic. You want to be a hero. You watch movies. Movies aren't about average guys. They're about heroes. And there's a desire to be a hero. There's a desire to save something. There's a desire to do something big. Terrorism is a good way to do that, if that's your desire. I mean, it fulfills that need. You can put it all on the line, quite literally, and blow yourself up, as Bob studied. But it's even better if it's a big, evil conspiracy you're fighting. If it's just a guy you disagree with, blowing people up over that's kind of harsh. But if there's a big conspiracy, now you're fighting for the truth, the way, and the light against the dark forces of evil. And that's a better fight.
Let me open the floor. This gentleman right here, we're going to run a microphone over to you.
But by the way, I'll say that groupthink I talked about reinforces that whole paranoia. The idea that you would actually look at the other side and see what they have to say, that's anathema, by sort of the definition of anathema.
Yes, sir, and if you'll identify yourself, please.
Good morning, sir. I am founder and editor of Fair Observer, which is a new publication that intends to have multidisciplinary and international debate and dialogue. It's been set up by a bunch of us who were together at Oxford and Wharton, and we hope to bring that dialogue that you talked about. Now, before I ask my question, very quickly, I did special ops against the Taliban pre-9/11, and I really appreciate the comments you made. My question to you is that, from an international perspective, a lot of the hate that is spoken in America is seen as representative of America. And the question from me to you is, how do you mitigate that, considering its international ramifications, especially its fodder to people who do propagate these conspiracy theories and run these suicide schools?
Right. Thank you. Well, a couple ways. First of all, we don't get enough credit for the good things we've done. during the, I'd use this just as a personal example, not during the Balkans, where my wife and I had a young Bosnian student whose leg had been blown off by the Serbs live with us for 3 years. I don't say that for personal appreciation, but the fact is the United States stopped a genocide there while Europe looked on. And it was a genocide directed at Muslims. And we get almost no appreciation for that. And we did it at marginal loss of U.S. lives or civilian lives on the ground there. The work we did in Indonesia, the United States, and the amount of effort we did, the Pakistan earthquakes, et cetera, and the list goes on. In Afghanistan, the amount of effort U.S. soldiers and leaders put into trying to avoid civilian casualties is astonishing. I've seen classified images of drone strikes where they had the guy in their sights, a really bad actor, and they didn't pull the trigger because a child was somewhere in possible range. We didn't do it. A guy who killed hundreds and hundreds of people. We don't get credit for that. Contrast that to the Soviets, who killed 1 million people, deliberately targeted civilians. What are the Soviets doing in Chechnya? Come on. I mean, so on the one hand, the media doesn't give us enough credit for the good we do. They overemphasize the mistakes, and they don't look at the contrasting conditions around the world. Having said that, there's no question in my mind that our engagement in the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, and I say this as a friend of Israel, a proud friend of Israel, is harming our national security and is harming Israel's security in the long run. Unless we reconcile that in a constructive and just way, we are going to be that will continue to be the focus for many people. I was in the Swat Valley in Pakistan right after they cleared it out. And we were meeting with people, and I was asking if people would, what their thought was about going into Waziristan and Baluchistan. First thing was, whoa, that's a different kettle of fish. And the main reason, because those guys down there, they're attacking you. These guys up here, they were attacking us. But the other issue, one guy said, hey, wait a second. Why should we fight against other Muslims given what you do in Palestine? This was the Swat Valley of Pakistan. It's a long way from Palestine, but it's on the minds of people because it's perceived to be unjust, and frankly, it is unjust, and it's counterproductive from a security perspective.
Other questions? We're still warming up here. We have one here, but while we're getting the microphone here, let me ask you one question, Brian. You talked about the Indonesia and the tsunami. General John Allen, who's the Deputy CENTCOM commander, ran that operation, and he ran it extremely competently. I thought it was a great job. Now, when I look at the Pakistan flooding today, and I'm on the State Department's list, and I see all of the things that Hillary Clinton and her team are trying to do, but frankly, it just isn't breaking out. And when I look at the amount of resources that we're spending on Afghanistan, roughly about $100 billion a year right now, but for $1 billion or so, you could completely change the infrastructure. You could create a possibility for at least a partial rapprochement between India and Pakistan with some of the management there. You can do a lot more relief, and it seems to be very hard. And I'm surprised myself, and I know there must be another side of the story, that someone like John Allen, who has done this, hasn't been tasked. I mean, it's not his option, but hasn't been tasked with actually doing in Pakistan with the flooding there what he did very competently in, say, the tsunami after effects.
I don't know the inside of that. I will tell you that in a rather paradoxical way, USAID some years ago, actually under Bush, really made an effort to brand everything, literally on down to pens, you know, a little button or a little stripe on a pen that said a gift to the American people, which I actually support. But interestingly enough, in some of the most controversial regions, we've actually pulled our USAID stickers off, the goal being to give the credit to the local government to empower the local government. So we ourselves have been sort of downplaying what we've done. The second issue is in Pakistan, there's so much, as we know, so much corruption and so much questionable use of funds. And so I'm not sure why more has been done. But we've also done quite a bit in Pakistan with the flooding as well.
Right here.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. Thank you, Congressman. My name's Rob Dubois. I'm a security advisor. And I could not sit still when you talked about facing both realities of the very bad men to shoot in the face when they're walking up with a suicide vest on, approaching my entry control point with children I'm giving candy to. The reality behind that, we have, it's very sensitive. There's a lot of things we can't say in the groupthink of D.C. and in America in general. The word arrogance comes to mind and is used a lot of times by writers who try to address how we're affecting other cultures. which you spoke to. You said, what else do we expect them to do when we support these behaviors, the indignity and so forth? So the previous question came from a special operator. I'm a retired SEAL, been overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan more than I've been home in the past decade. But I also write on peace, powerful peace, and addressing the reality that the more we use the hard power, the more we bring the hostility in return. We invite the negativity. We invite the negative energy. How do you see us using it at the base level working up? Because we have information operations, strategic communications, and so forth working down, but I think we need to engage people like us who have the double perspective all across the world.
Okay, thank you.
Two things. One, strategically in the field, tactically, we're using human terrain teams and really finally getting at this concept. Ironically, as some of you know, the academic community has criticized human terrain teams. These are anthropologists, sociologists, religious scholars who go into the field with the troops to try to understand the human terrain. It has been extraordinarily effective, saved a lot of U.S. civilian and even enemy lives, and brought people from the other side over. So in the field, we're finally getting that. General Petraeus is a huge advocate of that. And I've met many times with these folks. We actually had the first joint science committee and a special ops subcommittee of the HASC together on human terrain teams because I think it's central. That, however, is yet to filter up to the Congress at large, that issue of smart power, soft power. And the reason is, there are a variety, but it's easy to attack somebody. Here's the attack ad. By the way, when I finish this job, I'll do voiceover work. But it goes something like this. When our soldiers need better vests to protect them from enemy artillery, Congressman Baird wanted to spend the money on anthropologists. You're a SEAL. You get it. You've been in the front, and you've come into that village, and you've said to yourself, I don't know who to shoot.
There are a lot of political conconsultants here. I think they're going to hire you.
Yeah. I don't know who to shoot, and I'd rather not shoot anybody. I'd rather talk to somebody if I could. And we have not done that well at the higher levels. And one of the paradoxes, too, is the other thing that has to happen is colleagues have to not only have the courage to look at different sides, but actually to open their eyes when they go over. I was just over, when I was in Iraq in 2007 and came back, I opposed the Iraq invasion. I think it was a terrible mistake. But once you're there, you have a moral obligation to not just leave children to get their heads cut off by the al-Qaeda butchers, which was what was happening. And I came back and said, we're making progress, and it would be a mistake to pull out. I think that was the right thing to do, but it was not easy as a Democrat who'd voted against the conflict. But the troubling thing was you have colleagues who go into the theater knowing what they want to see. So you have two people go see the exact same thing and come back and report exact opposite things. And I think it's because of how we go in. We go in with the preset, and then we have the political. I mean, I've had colleagues say to me back then, you may be right, but I don't want to say it. Well, damn it, if it's true, and it's national security, and lives are on the line, suck it up. People are dying over there. The least you can do is have the integrity to look at things with objective eyes and tell the truth as best you understand it.
This gentleman.
Thank you. My name is Tony Berman. I'm Al Jazeera's head of strategy for the Americas based in Washington. Until a month ago, I was the managing director of Al Jazeera English based in Qatar, and I've been back in North America, located here for about a month. And my first week back was the week of the Florida pastor, was the aftershocks of the so-called Ground Zero mosque. So my question, one thing that I've found as somebody who is kind of re-engaged now in North America, particularly the U.S., is the incredible shrill level of the debate. And I guess I find your whole theme about is the environment here open to rational, to alternative approaches is a serious one. What is your, I guess, your own thinking as to what is driving it? And are you hopeful or confident that once this election, the congressional election, is over with in November, that the temperature will lower and that there'll be more of an openness to looking at alternative approaches to the problems that we all face?
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you. I'm not super optimistic, and the reason is that there are a number of factors that are contributing to the upset. I mean, first of all, we did get attacked on September 11th, and we got attacked by Muslim extremists. I mean, you've got to acknowledge that fact. Not that that represents all of Islam, but that was at least a part of the motivation of the people who attacked us, and that resonates still. And you have to be honest about that. One has to, not you, but one has to. But secondly, on top of that, we've got a terribly faltering economy, a lot of unemployed people, 20% in my congressional district in certain towns, and they don't know what's happened to them. And it's a global environment, and they've seen their sons and daughters and mothers and fathers get shipped off to some really faraway place to fight a war that's not clear anymore to many people what it's all about. And they want the world to be what it was. You know, it's not just what it was before President Obama. It's what it was before September 11th. I mean, really. And why can't you make it go back there? Why can't you make the economy be what it was when we had gone from a couple $100 billion deficit to a surplus? Why can't you make that happen? Why can't you go back to 5 to 7% unemployment, et cetera, et cetera? Well, all of those things are deeply, deeply distressing for understandable reasons, and there's just an undercurrent of anger that then gets targeted, and a convenient place to target it is out. And so you out members of your own country, whether that's President Obama, Nancy Pelosi, somebody else, but then you out the foreigners, and the foreigners in the most obvious case are Islam, because they look different, they worship different, they talk different, they're from different countries, and there is the link to the attack. And all of that is really hard to turn around. Remember earlier I said I think we've got to give the alternative nonviolence in the region. When's the last time you saw a major Western news story on nonviolent resistance? Nonviolent resistance. During the Civil Rights era, my good friend John Lewis was getting pounded crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. That was national news, and it troubled the American people. We do not, at our own country, see that there are extraordinarily courageous people on the ground throughout the Middle East trying to, and that's not just Palestine, Israel, that's within the other countries that have totalitarian regimes, trying to bring about change in a nonviolent way. That would create, I think, some better empathy with those folks, especially if you tied it to Islamic scripture that is part of the motivation. And again, not all the nonviolent activists are Muslim. There are many Christian activists as well, and many Jewish activists, of course, as well over there. So getting that different perspective. And then I actually think there needs to be a louder voice among moderate Muslims in the United States of America. I really believe that. I think there has to be a greater vocal condemnation of extremism, and they're out there. There are people doing great work on that front. You know, Jim Zogby and many, many others, the American Arab American Institute, but it's not getting the kind of coverage. So the American people don't have a person to identify with. I mean, if you were to ask the American people, name one Muslim anywhere on earth who advocates nonviolence, couldn't do it.
We have the Chief of Naval Operations, I think, still coming down. He went in the wrong entrance of the Capitol, so we've got time for one more question. Yeah, so there was another question over here I missed. Yes, right here. If we could run the microphone right here. This lady in the center. The lady not in red. There we go.
Hi, I'm retired Colonel Jill Morgenthaler, and I ran Homeland Security for the state of Illinois. And my concern is we recently had a young Lebanese American who wanted to bomb the Wrigley area late at night. No motivation. It wasn't anti-Christian or anything like that. He had his own screwed up reasons. And you brought up an excellent point. How are we going to counter terrorism without causing our own terror, especially against our population? And that does concern me. I'm hoping to hear ideas today. But anything, how do we prepare the public so we don't turn on our neighbors?
Excellent. Thank you very much.
The short answer is you need political leaders to douse the flames rather than fan them. And the reverse is happening right now. For political opportunistic reasons, if I can be more extreme than you and condemn the other side as somehow being soft, and then thereby make you feel good by association with me and more powerful, that's a pretty age-old tactic, and it works. And we have to call those people on it, and some aren't callable on it because their agenda is different. Their agenda is personal power. Now, there are some who just flat disagree with that, and we just have a difference of ideology, but there's a subset of people who are pretty darn cynical in their use of this issue. And I think you need that moderate, sensible, rational voice, and I think the media needs to do it. I think, back to Al Jazeera, I think they need to do it more in the Arab world, because, you know, they'll put, you know, a church of, what was that guy, 12 or something? They had nobody down in Florida, and suddenly this becomes international news. They're burning the Quran. Well, that's a nut job, that guy. He's not worthy of international news. He's truly not, and he's certainly not representative of the vast bulk of Americans. But he's easy to fan on the other side as well. So what has to happen is a louder voice, not loud in terms of volume, but in presence, from the people in this room and from our political leaders, and we need to call them on it. I mean, we need to have people who go to town halls and say to the demagogues on either side, look, you know, it's not just what you're saying I disagree with, it's why you're saying it, and how you're saying it, and what its impact is. Have you thought about what you're doing to the problem? And that's a tall order. We have to somehow communicate that that's actually a better approach. That's actually the fundamental approach of a democratic constitutional republic, and we have to communicate that, but it is extraordinarily difficult. I personally believe that, and I'm a big student of the founders. My one son is William Washington Nugent Baird, and the other is Walter Franklin Nugent Baird, and I can't tell you how many biographies. I don't think any of them could get elected today. Franklin was a vegetarian abolitionist, and he enjoyed recreational pursuits while in France. You know, Washington didn't want to engage in foreign military entanglements, et cetera, et cetera. But we need statesmen again, and I hope we can achieve that, or we're in some big trouble. And we won't cut this knot unless we have them. Thank you.
Well, we're having fun. You're not going yet, because our naval chief went to the Cannon House office building. So that's why somebody.
The Navy guy went to Cannon. He said, "If there's a cannon, I'm going."
On their way. Let me ask you. I mean, there may be other questions before, but let me ask you another question. I'm going to go to. Well, we'll go to Tom Pickering, but I also want you to reflect a little bit upon Congress's relationship with the executive branch. And can we get a mic over to Ambassador Pickering while we're doing this? You know, one of the things that really interests me is Tom Donilon has just become National Security Advisor, is on his way to become National Security Advisor. And I wrote a piece this week saying that one of the characteristics that I see in this administration, the executive branch, and I want to ask this before Tom because he may reflect on it as well, is how the White House is to some degree competing with other branches of government that it ought to actually be running. In other words, you know, I said in anticipating Gary Roughead coming is that the Pentagon actually works for the White House, but the National Security Council staff often feels as if it is competing with strategists in the capacity that exists in the Pentagon. And I'm wondering, from a congressional perspective, how do you see your branch surviving or floundering or not doing well vis-a-vis the executive branch? But before you answer me, let me ask Ambassador Pickering to comment.
Thanks. Tom Pickering, you were kind enough to refer to me in a hyperbolic fashion, so I'll leave that. Congressman, thank you for your frankness and your directness and your willingness to let most of it hang out, if I could use that perverse expression. My question is a companion question, one that you perhaps for good reasons steered away from. We're depressed that bipartisanship is an unknown science and a forgotten history, up here in particular. What could be done to resurrect it, or are we in the hopeless process of having partisanship be the watchword for the eternal future?
Tom, thank you. Tom, by the way, has been a real champion of something I also think that could be helpful on this, and that is science diplomacy. The use of science, and Tom and I have talked a lot about this, and I've championed it on our science committee. If you look worldwide, one of the things we are most respected for is our scientific and technological prowess and the openness of inquiry that allows that to happen. And I believe bringing scientists together internationally, you know, you can go to Iran and say, well, you've got schistosomiasis or something. And in fact, there are physicians, U.S. physicians and researchers there as we speak, I believe, working on that. So those kind of things, Tom, thank you for your work on that and many other issues. On the bipartisanship, two things. The first would be nonpartisan commissions to establish congressional boundaries. Gerrymandering is tremendously destructive to the system. It creates secure districts on both sides, and frankly, in general, the secure districts, in my experience, are you're less able to work with some of those folks because they're pandering to the extreme, and they'll get knocked out in a primary if they go to the middle. There are exceptions to that, or because they're just so absolutely content that their ideology is 100% right. Now, that is problematic in the House. It's lethal in the Senate, because an ideologue who is certain that he or she speaks with some divine inspiration and is more pure than anybody else, with the filibuster in hold, can really gum things up. And that then creates a lot of tension. It doesn't, the issue is, I want you to come my way a little bit. It's my way or the highway, and the highway then gets gridlocked. Second thing I believe is campaign finance reform. And I've struggled with this forever. If I could do one thing in life, it would be to say, we will establish public funding, we will ban all independent expenditures by individual candidates, and any independent expenditure above that gets matched. So no candidate can spend or raise money themselves, because it corrupts you. It takes away your time, takes away your soul, and it raises conflicts that are just untenable. And if other independent expenditures come, then public money goes up against them, and there'd be instant public acknowledgement of who is funding the ad. You know, free speech is a cherished value, but it's not free if you have to sell your soul to engage in it.
Any quick reflections on how Congress is doing vis-a-vis the executive branch and wrestling?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll be absolutely frank. I think Congress has dramatically undermined President Obama's efforts to move forward in peace in the Middle East. I don't believe that we're going to successfully deal with the settlement issue between Israel and Palestine unless there's serious pressure coming from the White House and from the Congress. And I think the congressional picture has either overtly and or covertly, meaning in private backdoor conversations, said to people, don't worry, we're not going to do anything of substance if they don't stop the settlements. And if you don't stop the settlements, you do stop a two-state solution. Geographically, it can't work. If the settlements continue to expand, you're not going to have a viable two-state solution. If you don't have a viable two-state solution, you are going to either have, and this is Ehud Barak, either apartheid or a non-democratic state. Just yesterday, Israel enacted a law that you have to take a loyalty oath that says you're loyal to Israel as a Jewish state. Well, there's a lot of Christians living in Israel, and there's a lot of Palestinian Muslims and others living in Israel, but they now have to take a loyalty oath, not just, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, but to a particular religious ideology, which is proscribed in the first line of the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, Bill of Rights. But now our number one ally in the region is saying you have to adhere to Israel as a Jewish state. I think that's going to be counterproductive. And I personally believe President Obama came in, gave one of the best speeches that U.S. president's ever given, and then created high expectations, most of which have been unfulfilled. And I'll finish with this story. In Gaza, right after the bombing, we meet 3 children, boys. We went with no security purposefully. We wanted to just meet people. The place has been blown up. People have the 1,000-mile stare. But by golly, here come a couple of 14-year-old boys, 3, roughly that. They've got their arms around them. They're pals. The first guy comes up and in broken English introduces himself. And we say, where'd you learn to speak English? From the UNRWA schools? He says, no. We said, television? No. Where? Shakespeare. True, this is a true story. Shakespeare, he said, I love Shakespeare. I read him all the time. And then I watch TV and learn my pronunciation. Let me introduce you to my friends. All this broken. First friend, just had a new nephew born. Guess the name of the nephew. This is 3 weeks after Cast Lead. Barack Obama. Third friend, wonderful boy, takes care of his family, attends mosque, builds Qassam rockets. Why do you build Qassam rockets? Because people come into our village with tanks and drop F-16, drop bombs on our village. What else am I going to do? What do you want to do with your lives? First boy, I want to be a teacher. Second boy, I want to be a physician, the one who had the nephew named Barack Obama. Third boy, I want to be an engineer. None of them said terrorists. The question for all of us is, how do we get those kids to be teachers, doctors, and engineers when so much of the surrounding is pushing them in opposite directions? And I hope we can get that answer in the discussion today.
Brian, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I also want to thank the Chief of Naval Operations, who apparently we sent to the wrong building, and we apologize in advance with that. But we're going to move immediately to Bob Pape and to the Chief. Thank you very much.
It is a great honor to introduce our next speaker. You're going to hear throughout today a new policy called offshore balancing. You're going to hear myself and other speakers refer to this policy as the key viable alternative to our current course. Well, it's one thing to have that policy connected to social science evidence. It's another thing to have that policy in action in Washington. And this next speaker, the next speaker you're about to hear, is probably the most pivotal speaker on this element today. Admiral Gary Roughead is the current Chief of Naval Operations, the highest-ranking officer in the Navy and the principal advisor to the President, Secretary of Defense, and Secretary of the Navy on the conduct of naval warfare. A graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, Admiral Roughead is one of only 2 officers to have commanded the fleets in both the Pacific and the Atlantic, where he earned numerous awards, including the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the highest joint service decoration in the U.S. military, among other highly prestigious awards as well. With his global experience and global responsibilities, there is no person better to articulate the future strategic options for the United States and the Navy's role in offshore balancing. Please join me in welcoming Admiral Gary Roughead.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's good to see some familiar faces in the audience. Thanks, Bob, for the introduction. I appreciate it, and also for pulling together the discussion and the panels that you have to investigate what I consider to be a topic of significant interest to those of us in uniform and to those of us interested in national security. I look forward to the opportunity to share my experiences and my outlook on where the Navy can contribute going forward, even if the topic at hand does not immediately summon up images of Navy ships and Navy airplanes and Navy submarines. As I will address, and one of the reasons why I believe this conference is so important is that the phenomenon of global terrorism has had such an immense impact on our national security planning and the international environment in which we operate, that it has really kind of shifted the discussion, indeed shifted the terms and conditions of global security. And long after the ongoing operations in Iraq and Afghanistan have subsided, the nation's experience with this phenomenon, and quite critically those of our international partners, will continue to weigh heavily. Let me be clear from the outset of my remarks. Since I'm going to discuss what the Navy has been doing outside of our current conflicts and what the Navy will do after these conflicts are over, that I want to be very, very clear that we in the United States Navy, every sailor, is fully committed to the operations and the fights that are being undertaken in Iraq and Afghanistan. It may come as a surprise to many that the United States Navy has 15,000 sailors on the ground in Iraq, Afghanistan, and in the Horn of Africa. That is 3,000 more sailors than are serving on our ships in the Middle East. In fact, when you combine the 15,000 ashore and the roughly 12 or so thousand at sea, our presence in the Middle East is about the same as the United States Marine Corps. It has been that way for some time, and it will continue along those lines. And even though the forces at sea may not be viewed as being contributing toward the operations there, about 30% of the fixed-wing aircraft that fly over our troops in Afghanistan are flying from the decks of United States Navy aircraft carriers to support the ongoing operations there. But we also believe that our nation's interests extend far beyond Iraq and Afghanistan, and so does our Navy. When it comes time for the other services to redeploy or to return to major bases in the United States, the Navy will continue to reset in stride as we have for centuries, and we will continue carrying on as before. Today, 46,000 sailors and about 40% of our Navy ships, and submarines are on deployment, delivering maritime security across the globe and providing the President with offshore options. We continue to prove ourselves to be formidable, flexible, and fast to respond, and are seeing more demand for naval forces than ever before. If we didn't maintain our global interests, if we were only present and engaged in those places where we have significant ground force commitments, some nations would aim to impose through intimidation their excessive claims on natural resources in common areas. Drug traffickers would face no obstacles in perfecting their just-in-time delivery system for illicit products, and pirates would exercise free rein in key shipping lanes, and the nation's prospects for a viable ballistic missile defense capability in the Western Pacific, the Middle East, and in Europe would not be in hand. Further, the positive steps that the Gulf Cooperation Council countries have taken to recognize the importance of maritime security in their own region would likely lose traction if the U.S. Navy was not present. This would be a development that we can ill afford when the operating environment in the Arabian Gulf is increasingly influenced by a more active and unpredictable Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy. Perhaps of greatest strategic importance over time, American military power without a global Navy presence would see the United States forfeit the opportunity to shape a favorable security environment in the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean. That is the landscape upon which we will act for the foreseeable future. The reality of our surroundings may not be evident to many Americans, given the immediacy of our ground campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan and the specter of international terrorism. But the issues should not be alien to us, just as America's requirement for her naval forces contribute across the range of potential threats is not alien to those of us in the United States Navy. In Bob's book, Cutting the Fuse, there's a compelling case made for what has become known as offshore balancing, military capabilities delivered from over the horizon, by arguing that sustained foreign military occupations are the predominant cause of suicide terrorism. I think this is fertile ground for discussion, though, because the political impact of terrorism on the current security environment will color our access and our range of options well into the future. We often look back on the Cold War era and certainly the post-Cold War era with a sense that there was relative peace. There were several conflicts over that span of time, some major and protracted, but they were exceptions to the normal operating state and have already been eclipsed in length by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In fact, Secretary Gates reminded an audience of college students just the other week that we are now engaged in the longest sustained combat in American history. Order in those eras was not maintained by large numbers of troops on the ground, but instead by a credible military presence offshore, deliverable from the sea or from the skies. So it was that in those old orders, peace predominated over the course of 5 decades, due in no small part to a constantly deployed Navy, a Navy whose contribution Samuel Huntington, a University of Chicago-trained man, would characterize in 1954 as America's new baseless ability to project power inland with carrier-based aircraft, amphibious lift, and naval artillery. Today, in many ways, the United States faces a new global order, one that has been shaped by the events of September 11th and its aftermath, and one whose international political aspects will only become clear in the post-drawdown in the Middle East. However, it's quite likely to be an era where we can expect 2 broad developments to take place. That sovereignty concerns, either where we are operating or where we are operating from, will limit or outright preclude the involvement of extensive land-based forces in the future, making offshore options for deterrence at sea and power projection from the sea all the more essential. And that this will be accompanied by a corresponding reawakening of the naval dimension of American power and influence, capable of ensuring the mechanisms of global prosperity and peace and countering anti-access or area denial in times of conflict. An important part of the President's national security strategy is to promote a just and sustainable international order as the indispensable factor in greater peace and prosperity. I feel strongly, for reasons of global economics, demographics, resource constraints, and climate change, that the emerging global order will in large part be influenced by a strong American Navy working closely with maritime partners. The productive economic force of globalization depends on the uninhibited international exchange of resources, goods, and ideas, activities that happen predominantly at sea. Commercial ships carry about 90% of all goods and resources that move on the planet. $40 billion worth of oil pass through the world's geographic choke points on a daily basis. Ideas cross the globe in seconds, not to mention the $3.2 trillion in commerce that moves underwater on transoceanic cables. That activity that fuels the global economy, regardless of disorder ashore, will continue. And so the stability and predictability of the maritime domain must be assured. Naval power will play a large role in influencing international players in this emerging global order with its capacity for targeted, rapid response to developments in the maritime domain, which span from the deep oceans to the key areas ashore that can be influenced from the sea. Most of the world's 26 megacities are in this littoral zone. Urban populations in 2050 will be the same as the global population in 2004. Resources will only become more dear, and those resources will increasingly be found in the littorals, as we have witnessed in our own waters at greater depths. In fact, 65% of the world's oil and 35% of gas reserves are in this littoral band around the continents. The order and stability of the maritime commons can be disrupted by man, but surely it can also be disrupted by climate change or natural disasters. The long-term trends in climate change are becoming more apparent, and some nations are planning accordingly. The impact of climate change on the migration of fishing stocks will likely send commercial fishing toward the poles and toward deeper water, raising the cost of a dietary staple for many of the world's societies. And the opening of the fifth ocean, the Arctic, for longer periods of time will provide new access to resources, migration of fishing stocks, and eventually new trade routes. That can't be overstated. It represents the first change of that magnitude since the end of the Ice Age. And I don't find it coincidental that China, a nation that previously had no claim in the Arctic region, has called for universal access rights to increasingly navigable Arctic waters. Add to this the ongoing effort to expand the Panama Canal, and it becomes clear that trade routes in our own hemisphere will change, with an inevitable impact on the total volume of activity in and around America's western approaches and the Gulf of Mexico. The expanded locks will double the canal's capacity and support passage for 90% of the world's commercial vessels, including 86% of liquefied natural gas ships, for instance, where the current canal can only support 6%. In this emerging security environment, as before, credible sea power can persist offshore within operational reach and form the foundation upon which other forms of national power can converge toward a common goal. Some observers credit the international political acceptability of naval forces to the idea that naval powers typically demonstrate neither an interest in nor a capability for affecting outcomes ashore. Others go further to suggest that offshore balancing as a naval activity is inherently anti-engagement, even isolationist. But beyond misunderstanding the close linkages we in the Navy see between developments in sea and events ashore, such arguments miss out on the work we are doing right now to provide resources for a range of options from the sea while empowering local authorities in areas of instability who strive for their own governance, the kind of measures that Bob called for in his book. The multi-mission and irregular warfare capabilities we deliver in support of joint task forces in the Philippines and the Horn of Africa, for example, directly support anti-terrorism efforts. Our counter-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden have engendered unprecedented international cooperation at sea. Our demonstrated ability to partner with other agencies in the U.S. government, as well as public and private international organizations, have proven crucial in most effectively building partner capacity in Africa, South America, and the Pacific Rim. It's worth noting that the most recent Africa Partnership Station, an activity that's based on one of our amphibious ships, in the most recent planning conference that was held in Naples, Italy, 25 nations came together to participate in that endeavor in preventive security and the rule of law. And since 2005, from our ships alone, we have treated over 500,000 patients in Africa, Asia, Central, and South America. Across such day-to-day engagement efforts to counter irregular challenges, naval forces preserve both the option and the capability to deliver decisive force in the event instability becomes disorder, but with the cumulative weight of established local relationships and political legitimacy in our favor. By doing so, an offshore balancing approach can afford our forces protection in the fullest sense of the term as they execute the engagement and the security assistance missions our nations ask of them. Regardless, the characteristics of dispersion, flexibility, and mobility, which Huntington observed in U.S. naval forces 56 years ago, remain today and will prove critical in assuring the access we have come to expect in the pursuit of our national interest. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Admiral. Terrific, terrific. Questions? Can we have a microphone come down here, please? While we're waiting, sir, you are distinguished not just at the Navy, but also for jointness, which means reaching out to other services. What do you see as the keys to taking the concept of offshore balancing and extending it in the joint environment?
I think what we have been able to do with the positioning of our forces in various places around the world is to have those forces be the catalyst, the facilitator, indeed the platform from which other forces can operate. It is not uncommon, for example, for special operations forces to operate from our ships and our submarines as they work around the world. As we pursue addressing some of the irregular challenges, and I talked of some of the humanitarian assistance work that we do, we come together with the other services and non-governmental organizations to be able to bring those capabilities inshore to address the needs of those populations that, quite frankly, in their wildest dreams would never see that type of medical or humanitarian assistance be brought into their areas. And this is all done in a joint context. So I think it's a pretty rich joint environment. But what we are able to provide is that base, if you will, that facility offshore that does not infringe on sovereignty, but yet has the ability to interact with local populations in pretty significant ways. And one could say, well, that's just on the beach. But most recently, we've had an amphibious ready group, a group comprised of our amphibious ships and our Marines, delivering humanitarian assistance into Pakistan. It's the second time that we've done that in about the last 10 years or so. The first response to Haiti, the earthquake in Haiti, was a Pacific Fleet guided missile destroyer whose last mission was ballistic missile defense in the Mediterranean, and she was just going home the long way and happened to be passing by Haiti, where she was able to put in place the air control mechanism that then enabled the relief effort to come in. And in my own personal experience, having been in the Pacific during the tsunami of 2004, that became the genesis for much of our humanitarian assistance disaster response work that we've undertaken, because the first forces to arrive on scene were the United States Navy off the coast of Indonesia in Aceh.
Thank you. Most helpful. Yes, sir.
Gareth Porter, Interpress Service. Admiral Roughead, you dropped some hints that the Navy has a somewhat different strategic viewpoint on U.S. national security policy with regard to terrorism by mentioning the sovereignty issue and the potential that imposes, potentially constraints that imposes on U.S. military activities, or should impose on them, I guess. But at the same time, you have fully endorsed the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You have not said anything at all about the continued involvement of the United States in Pakistan, in Yemen, Somalia, and so forth, using drone attacks and special operations forces. I'd like to ask you to be specific about whether, in fact, you do see an ongoing problem that is related to the issues that Robert Pape has addressed in his work, of U.S. military activities actually being part of the problem rather than being part of the solution. In regard
we got it.
to terrorism.
Thanks very much.
And I think, to the point, as you said, I do endorse the activities that we have underway. That said, as I look to the future, based largely on my experiences over the years, is that I do believe in the future that the sensitivities associated with sovereignty will become more acute. And it is in the form of the offshore options and the capabilities that we bring that can be mitigated. And so that's how I would see the future unfolding.
Yes, sir. Go right ahead. Yep, we have. And if you're, yep.
My name is David Eisenberg, and let me say thank you very much for making time to give your comments today. I'm very pleased as next 7th Fleet decade to have a chance to hear your remarks. I think at least part of your comments illustrated a disconnect between what we are doing and perhaps what we should be doing. You mentioned our operations in the Gulf of Aden. Most analyses that I have read over the years from in almost all the military journals suggest that even with orders of magnitude more effort by regular military naval forces, not just U.S., but other countries, it would not appreciably prevent or deter ongoing piracy activities by the Somalis. Given that, is it not conceivable at least that ultimately the solution lies in the restoration of a politically, economically, socially viable government of Somalia, which we currently do not have? If that's the case, then perhaps more effort, more money ought to be devoted through agencies other than DOD and the services. Is it conceivable that you and the other Joint Chiefs, it may be impolitic for you to answer this, might at least consider taking some money out of the DOD budget and giving it to other departments and agencies? I note that your boss, Secretary Gates, in the past has been very articulate on the point and said, look, we can't do it all, and it's not our job. You have to turn to state and other agencies. So if we are looking at piracy in Somalia, you know, would you go along with that?
Well, I think Secretary Gates on several occasions has been clear about the cooperation and the desire, indeed the need for other agencies to pursue solutions that you addressed. And I have been very clear as I have talked about the issue of piracy that ultimately the solution will be found ashore in a rule of law and an enforcement of laws that get to the heart of what is basically a criminal business. To say that the coalition of forces, and I refer to it as the strange bedfellows, simply because 5 years ago, if you would have said that the U.S. and NATO and the EU would be conducting piracy operations, everybody would have said, fine. But then we have Russia, and we have China, and we have Malaysia, and we have India. Iran shows up occasionally. So the fact of the matter is that to do nothing at sea, it would be unfettered. Right now, with the work that the partners are doing in the Somali Basin, Gulf of Aden, and the best practices that shipping companies have now put in place, at least that is making it harder for the pirates to do their work. But I don't disagree at all that the solution is one of getting ashore and stopping the problem ashore, much as the littoral states around the Straits of Malacca did a few years ago. Significant problem. They put in place a maritime security structure. They worked together. They cooperated. They had the benefit of rule of law ashore, and you could squeeze the pirates both from the shore and the sea, and that's what we have to do.
Great. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
My name is Ellen Baugh. I'm a journalist. My son is a young officer on the USS Cole. Today, in fact, is the 10th anniversary of the blowing up of the USS Cole by suicide bombers. And, in fact, right now the service is going on in Norfolk for the 17 who died and the 39 who were wounded. My son is working right now at that service. He has just returned from 7 months off of Somalia and Yemen, and they did apprehend pirates. They didn't kill any. They took weapons away. They turned some over. They are doing remarkable work. They also found refugees and helped refugees who are floating around on these ships. And so I appreciate the work that they're doing. And his roommate went to Haiti and is in Pakistan right now. So I'm a biased mother. But,
and you should be, I might add.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you. No, I think and I had the pleasure of visiting Cole in Djibouti on a recent visit while the ship was deployed. And I made a comment at the time, you know, we in the military often hearken back to our traditions and experiences that we've had. And one of the great famous ones that exists in our Navy, and it's probably even been heard in American households from time to time, is don't give up the ship. And we seem to think of that as a bit of our heritage from the past. But if you ever want to see and hear a story of heroism and that embodied don't give up the ship, the saving of the Cole in Aden Harbor 10 years ago, reinforced to every sailor that serves today the importance of that passion, that commitment, and that gritty determination that can make a difference in any fight.
Yes, sir. Good morning, Admiral. I'm David Shore of the Stanley Foundation. Thank you for your remarks, and I was especially glad to hear you talk about the idea of a just and sustainable international order. It's something I think a lot about, and I should mention that I talk a lot about global public goods, and prominent in my list is always the free sea lanes communication and offshore balancing. I want to ask you about China, both in kind of a glass half empty and a glass half full way. First, immediately, can you give us your perspective on the South China Seas and the Korean Peninsula, and where the PLA is and where the relationship can get to be, and then looking down the road more in kind of a can the glass get more than half full way. In terms of the provision of global public goods, looking down the road, is free sea lanes of communication something that for time immemorial the United States needs to provide, or could we imagine that the just and sustainable international order, which after all succeeds if political evolution in China and elsewhere goes in a good direction, could that be a shared global public good someday?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the question. I've had the opportunity to see the PLA Navy evolve from a fairly unique perspective since the early 90s as a result of some assignments that I've had, opportunities that I've had to visit with the PLA, to spend time with my counterpart in the PLA Navy. And what is happening in China and the PLA Navy in particular is not unusual. This has happened throughout history. As a nation's economy rises and as that economy is based on the flow of resources coming in and goods going out, there's a tendency that that nation will build a navy to assure those flows. The Portuguese did it, the Dutch did it, the Brits did it, we did it, and now we see China doing that. The desire that we have, obviously, is to have a relationship with a PLA Navy that is more transparent than it is today. But I would say that we have been able to do some things with the PLA Navy. I mentioned counter-piracy. We have worked through the ability to communicate better with one another at sea. As we speak, a PLA Navy hospital ship is in Africa, not unlike what we have been doing for the past few years. When our hospital ship was on mission in South America last year, I invited my PLA counterpart to send some doctors to that ship, which he did. And so I do believe that there are some opportunities. The desire for transparency and adherence to international law is what we seek in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and for the ability for those nations to sort out the competing maritime claims that exist. And I'm confident that as we go forward, working with our friends and partners in the region, we will avoid any significant friction that can develop from those sorts of claims. So I think there are some opportunities. I would like to see greater transparency on the part of the PLA Navy, but it's a Navy that's following a trajectory that is not unique in history.
The Admiral really does run policy all over the world, and I'm told that it's time for him to go back to work. I just want to, we can take one more. Yes, actually, can we get the closest microphone to, yes, right, yes, sir, we'll do one last one. And then his staff is going to.
Good morning, sir. Atul Singh from the Fair Observer. Very quick question. You mentioned China. What do you think will be the biggest challenge for the U.S. Navy readjusting in terms of its relationship with the Chinese Navy as it rises and, of course, changes the equation, global equation? Thank you.
I believe, where you say readjusting our relationship with the PLA Navy, I believe that we have been on a modest trajectory to work cooperatively in areas. I think that what we have been able to do in the Gulf of Aden is a very positive step. I would like to see that translated into other geographic areas where we enjoy the same level of cooperation and communication and mutual support. And so I don't see a readjustment. I see us continuing to move forward to work with the PLA Navy in a cooperative way and in a way that provides for the free, unencumbered, and predictable use of the sea lanes and appropriate access to the resources that may be on the bottom or that simply may be swimming in the oceans. And that's what I focus on in developing the relationship with them. Thank you very much.
Yeah. In closing, just before he goes, I just want to say that truly great leaders don't just listen, they act. And what we're seeing today is a man who's really acting to build our better future. And just help me thank him for coming today. Thank you.